I am going to be talking about an ethical and legal issue in family counseling that has the potential to come up pretty frequently when working with children um, of high conflict divorces. And so I'll be looking at the role of the therapist in custody disputes. So, the problem statement, like I mentioned, custody disputes have the potential to put therapists in the middle of very challenging family conflicts. So, parents may strongly urge therapists to provide a witness statement or write recommendation letters for custody arrangements. So, this is something that can come up pretty frequently. And it has come up actually for me during my internship, which is why I decided to look into it further um, and kind of figure out the exact ethical codes that were in question. So, why does this matter? If a therapist were to take sides, this would compromise their neutrality, which is actually one of the main ethical codes within the American Counseling Association Code of Ethics. So this could also risk the therapeutic alliance. Secondly, if the child's disclosure to the therapist is used in legal proceedings, this could potentially cause harm to the client, which would pose an additional ethical risk. So let's say the client told the therapist that they would like to, in fact, live with their mom instead of their dad, and then this gets back to dad, and then dad could take it out on the child, or it could potentially lead to really unfavorable circumstances for the child. And finally, making custody recommendations could lead to legal liability, and the counselor could be at risk of licensing board actions when their ethics are called into question. So I'll be looking at 3 different ethical frameworks. First, the ACA Code of Ethics, Section A1A. States that counselors must promote client welfare and avoid imposing harm. Section A7A, counselors should avoid dual relationships, such as being a therapist and a custody evaluator. And B1C, respecting confidentiality and taking caution in sharing records for legal proceedings. And then the National Board for Certified Counselors Code of Ethics, within Section 47, it's outlined that counselors should not have multiple roles in a counseling relationship, as this could affect their judgment and increase the risk of harm for the client. So, very similar to the ACA. And counselors should not provide their opinion about custody unless they're qualified and court appointed, and also not the client's therapist, the child's therapist. And finally, the state licensing boards for Colorado for licensed professional counselors. So I'll be working in Colorado, so I wanted to look into this. States that language in the informed consent must reflect the scope of the LPC role. So I think it's important when giving the informed consent to the parents that it's not only just signed and returned to you, but also going over some details within it that you could foresee being a problem with in the counseling relationship, just a potential conflict. And also just going over the informed consent in its entirety, but pulling out some of those specific areas that could potentially be an issue. And then LPCs cannot make custody recommendations unless they're specifically trained, court appointed, and qualified as an evaluator, and also not the child's therapist. So, for example, I mentioned earlier that I was had a client where this sort of situation happened. So I was working with 15-year-old Trevor and both of his parents following a divorce. and the mom asked me to write a letter to the court stating that Trevor prefers to live with her. So I was faced with making a choice between A, I could choose to have a dual role in which I was the therapist and an evaluator, and this would happen if I were to write a recommendation letter. Or B, I could say no, and then the parents would be frustrated and upset if I deny their request for a letter. But on the other hand, my integrity and professional license would be protected. So that's a pretty big upside. So, possible ethical solution number one, maintain therapeutic boundaries. And this is what I did. So, declining the request politely, and then explaining the ethical violation to the parents so they can better understand the counselor's role, which is to provide therapeutic support rather than acting as a custody evaluator. So, just highlighting these are two different roles, two different people, two different jobs. And then using proper consent, the counselor can offer to provide a statement of treatment progress that does not include custody recommendations. I did not do this. I found this out later when I was working on this presentation. So that could have been something that I could have done. But fortunately, I declined the request. The mom was, she wasn't too upset about it. I think she was just kind of like trying to wrangle anybody she could into helping with the situation, which was a really tricky situation. And then possible ethical solution number two would be to refer them to a qualified custody evaluator. And the counselor could clarify the distinction between therapy and custody evaluation, refer the court or the parents to a licensed custody evaluator trained in custody assessments, and then continue therapy as usual with Trevor, having maintained their role as a therapist only. So just getting back to that therapeutic alliance with the client and working with the family and maintaining neutrality. So, best practices in a situation like this, a counselor should set clear expectations about the limits of involvement, and this should be confirmed at intake. So, again, part of the informed consent that should specify the role of the therapist in legal matters, just being really clear about that. And then redirecting the parent to the appropriate legal resources if needed. So there are specific lawyers that work with this sort of situation, like guardian ad litems. And I actually volunteered as a CASA for a long time. And my job was essentially to help the client's voice be heard. And, they would say where they wanted to live, and the court would require all sorts of documentation for this and supervision and my evaluation and all of that. So this is a whole nother job, a whole different role. This is not the role of the therapist, even though we really want to help and we want to help everyone. But this is one of those areas we have to draw the line. So in conclusion, it's essential that counselors maintain their neutrality throughout the therapeutic process. And it's outside the role of a counselor to make custody recommendations. So these are just some of the main points based on these best practices, and just mainly remembering to maintain that neutrality, do no harm to the client, make clear expectations with the parents and the client too about our role as a counselor, so that there isn't any discrepancy or possible situation where they might request something like this, avoiding the entire situation altogether by being really clear at the beginning of treatment, and also really clear with your boundaries, and just maintaining that therapeutic alliance above all else, making sure that we're serving the client in the best way possible. Thank you very much, and here are my references, and have a good night.